Alright guys, what's up? It's the Ascension of Babylon. What we do here is we talk about the occult, we talk about spirituality and spiritual self-development, and we talk about the healing process. If that's your thing, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. I would appreciate it. And with that being said, let's move on to the topic of discussion. So, the vampiric path is about the refinement, the embodiment, and of course, the integration of predatory instincts in balance with the human ego. And this also implies that we're going through a process of not deleting the ego, but expanding the ego's ability to hold these more primal components of our being in a way that is truly aligned with the way that our soul is wanting to experience itself. So when we're looking at like the outer net of occultism, you see a lot of people that use the term vampire and they're doing these more predatory rites of spirituality where they're harvesting people's energy and they're doing psychic warfare and they're really into the aesthetics and stuff like that, and that's cool. But the path of the vampire is actually much deeper than that. And it's not only a path of expanding the ego to where it can be a container for these more primal energies within the self that are in connection to our animalistic desires and urges in nature in general, but it's also a path of embodying the void state or the void consciousness. And this is something that's actually very challenging, and it's very difficult because we're usually wired into certain identities that are very rigid, and they're not really too mutable because we go through early childhood trauma, we go through certain kinds of societal conditioning and things of that nature, and we tell ourselves, this is who I am, this is who I'm always going to be, and there's always that part of us that tells us that always being the same way is authentic. That's what real is to this part of us when we're existing inside of that part and we haven't dissolved it out of that very rigid role that it's playing to create that identity. So there's a lot of expansion on the path of the vampire, and this expansion eventually leads us into the void, to where we embody that very fluid state of consciousness that is the byproduct of that void energy, where we're interacting with these very liminal spaces within ourselves and within the collective, and even within the universe itself. Liminal spaces that most human beings are very wired to be completely in resistance to, because reality is no longer black and white in these liminal spaces. It's what we make of it. It's what we create it to be, and it's what we mold it to be. So when we're always seeking for someone to give us the answer, or some teacher to guide us and to support us and to, try to confirm, what we already believe and things of that nature, these liminal spaces can be really hard to enter, and there's going to be a lot of protective mechanisms within the psyche that prevent us from entering that liminal space within the self and these liminal spaces of reality in general. So the path of the vampire is actually very, very challenging. It takes the capacity to die. This is why in vampire mythology, even modern movies and stuff like that, there's the element of death, where kind of diving head first into the death current. We're channeling that death energy into our body, and we're letting go of protective adaptations, and we are actually rewiring the way our system works, and we're forming new neural networks that support identities that are much more fluid and much more expansive, rather than living inside of like a rigid identity structure that's not really an emanation or an embodiment of who we truly are underneath the surface of that protective identity. So the vampire is a being that experiences many different death cycles and many different rebirths. And this is directly connected to what I said about the void. When we go into the void, there's going to be the presence of death energy. And the more the more we resist it, the heavier that presence gets until we finally crack. We finally dissolve and we move into this space to where we're not over-identified with positive or negative, with masculine or feminine, with chaos or order. We're not overly identified with certain goals and, end outcomes and end results and stuff like that. But we get stripped away to such an extent to where we now exist in a state that is much more rooted in presence, because this is what we truly are, and the wide spectrum of our power is actually existing in the present. It's not in the future, it's not in the past, it's in the present moment. So if we want to access more of our source self, we can even say the source energy, divine consciousness in general, we need to be in this state of presence. And this is also why a vampire is a person that has a very unique connection to God, or a very unique connection to the source in general. And rather than merging with the source in the way that most people understand it or do it, it's like we're refining the source within ourselves. Rather than merging with the universe, the vampire expands their awareness to cultivate and refine their own inner universe, realizing that we are a universe in our own right, and we don't need to overly blend with some idealized concept of God or something outside of the self, when the self is just as sacred as anything that's in the stars or anything that's in the solar system or any outer externalized concept of God. A vampire is a person that embraces the God within, but this comes with the very challenging path of many deaths and many rebirths. And it also comes with the very challenging path of, ego dissolution to a very high level, such a high level that the average person does not actually have the capacity to walk this path. Not saying that there's not, a good amount of us out there, because there is, and there's more people embracing this path in the present moment, because it's actually also in direct connection to the collective evolution of our species. And I've kind of spoken about this in other videos, but this is a path that most people don't need to walk, and most people are not meant to walk, because of not only the ego expansion that takes place. So by expansion I mean we're making the ego more so able to hold the energies of all parts of ourselves, and we're accepting those parts. But the ego, we can say subtraction or deflation, that is also taking place by paradox. So to expand the ego's ability to be a channel for the divine source energy inside of us, there's a process of deletion and subtraction that is also taking place simultaneously. So as we are deflating, we are also eventually expanding. And when I say expanding the ego does not mean your false sense of self-importance or anything like that. The ego is our sense of self. In our sense of self, we want it to be in harmony with the way our soul is truly intending to experience itself. And our soul is intending for us to embody all the different parts of us. So this could be the higher self parts, the lower self animal parts that are more in resonance with our primal nature, you know, the different aspects of our shadow self, which, by the way, is not just our traumas. That's only the outer net of what the shadow self is. But as we go deeper into the shadow self, we realize we have this primordial void type energy inside of us, or what we can call the primordial self. On the left-hand path, this is actually called the daemon. So on the right-hand path, there's a lot of people that, they're more so connecting with the higher self. But the more raw, unfiltered aspects of the higher self are actually going to be the daemon. So the same way that we have in unconscious these aspects of self that are actually creating the entirety of our conscious experience, even though we're not always conscious of it, the higher self is still something that's very much evolving. Everything's always evolving. So the higher self also has that, we can say, unconscious layer of its being, even though of course it's much more conscious of it than we are. The higher self has that darker polarity. It has that shadow. And essentially that's what the primordial self is, or the void self, or what a lot of people also call the daemon. So the vampire is a person that has a very deep connection with the shadow self, therefore a very deep connection with the daemon, but we're also balanced within the ordering principles of the higher self as well. And all of this we're holding within the ego. The ego becomes like a cup, and we fill that cup up with these different aspects of self that are now working in balance with each other. All of this is also being channeled into the physical body. So the path of the vampire is really a very deep path, and it comes with a profound process of transformation. It's not just about taking people's energy and the aesthetics, I'm a vampire, and things of that nature, but it's much, much deeper, and it always leads the person who actually authentically embraces it to the void. The primordial chaos space that has no definition whatsoever. It's just pure infinite potential that we start pulling, we can say reality out of to form it in alignment with the way that our soul is actually wanting to express itself, versus, kind of living in all these different protector parts and these more so negative orientated, or oriented, whatever the word is, identities that are not really who we are. And the vampire is also a person who is very willing to go through identity death, to embrace different identities, because we understand that there's no such thing as right or wrong when it comes to identity. It's just about what our soul wants to experience and how is it that we want to create our reality, because the identity heavily supports in the reality that we are both attracting and creating at the same time. So the vampire says, okay, what identity do I want to create my reality with? And, there might be an identity to the vampire that's authentic 6 months ago or 3 months ago or a year ago, but then we realize we can let go of that identity to embrace a new path of identity that comes with, slightly different beliefs and different ways of perceiving ourselves and others and things of that nature. So the vampire path is truly a path of expansion within the ego, once again the sense of self, and just within self in general. But that expansion always comes with subtraction. So the vampire is a being that is going through a very deep process of subtraction. I think this is what I wanted to say. And yeah, I was very inspired to kind of make this video today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate every single one of you very much, and I will absolutely catch you in the next video. Thank you so much for being here.